In Colombia, rebel groups sometimes declare ceasefires, so people can vote safely. That tells you that this is not normal democracy, despite being among the longest standing in Latin America. Instead of normal, peaceful process, country is filled with brutal violence during a fight for power. Big chunks of country's territory is under the influence of illegal armed groups, and politicians are being killed on a daily basis. Colombia is heading into elections to Congress on March 8, 2026, and we are going to break down what's really at stake and why it's a matter of life and death for so many people. This election is about power. President Gustavo Petro and his left-wing coalition won the majority in Congress. With it, they could push through stalled reforms and potentially open the door to rewriting parts of Colombia's 1991 constitution, which Petro says is necessary to build a stronger social state and deepen democracy. Those are enormous ambitions for a president whose approval rating has fallen to around 37% amid corruption scandals and legislative gridlock. In recent days it has rebounded, but with this volatility, nothing is certain. And that's not the end of his problems, because at the same time he's losing structural advantages. The 5 guaranteed congressional seats granted to the former FARC party, which often supported Petro's Pacto Histórico in crucial votes after the 2016 peace deal, are expiring. By the way, having a left-wing president in Colombia is actually kind of an anomaly, considering the country's modern history, but I'll explain that in a moment, so stay with me. One more important thing, Colombia votes for president in May 2026. These congressional elections will shape that battlefield. In many ways, the presidential campaign has already begun. Colombia became violent overnight. In 1948, a presidential frontrunner, Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, was assassinated in Bogota. The city burned and riots became known as El Bogotazo. What followed was nearly a decade of bloodshed called La Violencia, a war between liberals and conservatives that killed over 200,000 people. In 1958, both sides tried to stop the chaos and signed a deal, the National Front. For the next 16 years, liberals and conservatives shared power through a formal rotation system. It solved the problem for a while, but it also blocked people outside those two parties from participating in politics and sparked a feeling that the system was rigged. That pushed some people to establish armed groups. FARC, Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, emerged in 1964 originally as a peasant self-defense group with Marxist leanings. ELN, the National Liberation Army, formed around the same time inspired by Che Guevara and the Cuban Revolution, and others, including M19, a more urban guerrilla movement. That naturally caused a reaction, and paramilitary groups, most notably as the AUC, emerged in the 1980s and 90s to fight the guerrillas. Besides their stated goal, they didn't miss the chance to terrorize civilian populations and worked hand in hand with drug traffickers. And when we talk about Colombia, it's hard not to mention Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel, which poured gasoline to the fire. Corruption, crime, and wars over territory. Politics, money, and guns blended into one ecosystem. Presidential candidates were assassinated. Newspaper editors were blown up. At one point, 500 police officers were killed in a single year. Colombia had one of the highest murder rates in the world, but the heaviest price was often paid by the political left. Some tried to enter politics legally and founded the Patriotic Union Party in 1985. They didn't have an easy life. The party was subjected to political violence from drug lords, paramilitaries, and even security force agents during the mid-1980s. Many politicians were killed, including 2 presidential candidates, 8 members of Congress, and hundreds of local politicians and activists. Many now describe what happened to the Patriotic Union as political extermination. The party was eventually wiped out of Colombia's political landscape, but it didn't stop the aggression directed at leftists. This pattern of murdering social leaders and left-wing activists continued through the 2000s, 2010s, and it continues today. In 2024 alone, over 100 social leaders and human rights defenders were killed in Colombia, according to INDEPAS, the Institute for Development and Peace Studies. That's why having a left-wing politician, a former M19 guerrilla, as president in this country is so surprising. For millions of Colombians on the left, his victory was historic, almost unthinkable, but for others it felt like the system had been turned upside down. And now the same system, the electoral system, will decide whether that political shift continues or reverses. If you like this kind of political breakdowns, subscribe for more. It really helps the channel. Now let's move on to the political system in Colombia. Colombia operates under bicameral Congress, two chambers. The Senate, higher, represents the country as a whole. The House of Representatives, lower, represents individual regions. Any major reform must pass through both. So if Petro wants real power, he needs control in both chambers. The Senate currently has 103 seats. 100 are elected nationwide through proportional representation, and parties have to hit 3% threshold to win seats. 2 additional seats are reserved for indigenous communities, and 1 seat automatically goes to the runner-up in the presidential election, giving the opposition a guaranteed voice. The House works differently. Seats are distributed by region. Each department sends its own representatives. But there are also special constituencies, seats for Afro-Colombian communities, 1 for indigenous groups, 1 for Colombians abroad, and 16 so-called peace seats created for areas most affected by the armed conflict. These special seats were designed to integrate historically marginalized communities into the political system after decades of violence. Parties can choose between open and closed lists. In a closed list, you vote for the party and the party decides who takes the seats. In an open list, you can vote for a specific candidate within the party. It sounds technical, but it shapes internal party power. There's also something unusual: voto en blanco. It's not just leaving the ballot empty, it's an active protest vote. And if it wins the most votes in a race, the election must be repeated with entirely new candidates. I personally think more countries should implement this mechanism so people who don't trust any politician can have a chance to also share their opinion in elections. Colombians treat their elections very seriously. From Saturday afternoon before the vote until Monday morning, Colombia enforces Ley Seca, a nationwide alcohol ban. No bars, no stores, no partying. Democracy first. Remember those guaranteed seats for the former FARC party? They were part of 2016 peace deal, meant to bring former rebels into legal politics. Those guarantees are expiring, which means the political protection created by the peace agreement is slowly disappearing. And we'll come back to what that means for security and Petro's total peace strategy later in the video. But first, who's actually fighting for control of Congress? Pacto Histórico, the governing left-wing coalition. Pacto Histórico is the dominant left-wing force in Colombian politics, the most influential bloc at this moment and a big favorite to win the most seats. Born from a fusion of progressive movements and parties, it's the political home of President Gustavo Petro's agenda. Its leaders are campaigning on deep social reforms, more state involvement in the economy, and the continuation of Petro's policy priorities. They are the most organized bloc on the left and the main champion of change in Congress. Centro Democrático, the hard opposition. The first major force on the other side is Centro Democrático. Think of it as Colombia's hard conservative opposition. Tougher on crime politics, a more market-friendly approach, and deep skepticism toward Petro's reforms. In Congress, they are the most consistent anti-Petro bloc, the party that opposes his agenda not just tactically, but ideologically. Liberals and conservatives, rivals on paper, aligned against Petro in practice. Then you have the two traditional giants, the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. Historically, these were mortal rivals. Today, they are no longer fighting over power like it's life and death. They are pragmatic regional machines, and in key votes, they often vote together, not because they love each other, but because under Petro, their shared interest has frequently been the same: blocking or watering down his reforms. So if you draw the map, you get a clear pattern: Pacto Histórico on one side and anti-Petro front on the other, anchored by Centro Democrático and often reinforced by liberals and conservatives. It's not a formal coalition, but in crucial votes it behaves like one. Then there are the parties that don't always pick a side, but often decide who wins. Cambio Radical is a center-right pro-business party with strong regional roots, especially on the Caribbean coast, known for blending regional interests with shifting alliances. Partido de la U is a centrist force born from past governing alliances, often aligning with whoever offers legislative leverage and positioning itself as a stabilizing force rather than a confrontational one. These are pragmatic and transactional players, which doesn't make them loyal allies of Petro, but they can be negotiated with. And that's why Petro's governing strategy is less about commanding power and more about constant maneuvering, bargaining for a fragile majority vote by vote. That's why he's trying to reshape the political landscape in his favor. And the challenge is enormous if you look at his approval rating and the scandals, corruption, accusations, and internal chaos that we'll discuss in Chapter 7. The outside the Axis parties. Finally, there are smaller parties trying to position themselves away from this conflict, aiming to be a third space, less ideology, more governance. Alianza Verde is a center-left, issue-driven party focused on green politics, anti-corruption, and institutional reform. Ahora Colombia is a centrist reform coalition that presents itself as an alternative to both Petro's camp and the traditional party establishment. Its brand is simple: less polarization, more institutions. So this election is not just left versus right. It's Petro's bloc trying to expand power and opposition front trying to contain him, and a middle layer of kingmakers who can swing either way. In a Congress this fragmented, power belongs to whoever can build majority, even if it only lasts one vote. Colombia's campaign is on paper about basic things: healthcare, pension reform, climate, education, and the social safety net. Petro's camp argues the state should do more access, more protection, more public capacity. The opposition says you wreck what works and you blow up the budget. But here's the problem. In large parts of Colombia, politics isn't debated, it's enforced. According to the EUAA, violence doesn't just happen in the background. Armed groups can control communities in ways that resemble parallel governance schemes, meaning they act like a shadow state, setting rules, controlling movement, punishing people, deciding what's allowed. And under Petro's total peace approach, ceasefires, talks, and negotiations, those groups didn't disappear. They grew. A security report cited in the EUAA says the number of combatants in illegal armed groups rose from around 15,000 in mid 2022 to almost 22,000 by June 2025, despite the government negotiating ceasefires under the Total Peace Plan. So when Petro says, "Give me Congress so I can fix the country," a lot of voters hear darker question. Is the state expanding or is it shrinking? Take the Gaitanistas, also known as the Gulf Clan, AGC. The EUAA describes AGC as one of the most powerful illegal organizations in the country, with over 14,000 combatants present in hundreds of districts across most departments. This isn't a street gang, it's a nationwide machine, fighting rivals, running illegal economies, and pressuring communities. And the violence isn't just crime statistics, it hits civilians, and it hits public services. In 2023, 511 attacks against healthcare were recorded. Unprecedented numbers, according to PAHO cited by the EUAA. In 2024, the ICRC reported hundreds of conflict-related incidents affecting health services, threats, restricted access to care, theft of medicine, forcing staff to work under unsafe conditions. Education gets dragged into it too. The EUAA cites reporting that armed groups use schools for military purposes and that attacks on educational facilities increased. And the Norwegian Refugee Council recorded 52 attacks on schools or school routes in first half of 2025, affecting nearly 9,500 students, teachers, and staff. So healthcare and education aren't just policy platforms. Sometimes they are literally battlefields, and the killing hasn't stopped. European Agency of Asylum notes that massacres, defined as the killing of 3 or more civilians in one incident, continued. It cites 123 alleged massacres in 2023, with many verified by the UN, and 22 massacres in just the first 4 months of 2025 recorded by the Ombudsman's Office. That's the campaign issue nobody can spin away. Security, state control, and whether total peace is peace or a pause that let armed groups expand. The opposition doesn't hesitate to call past total policy aimed to negotiate simultaneously with all armed groups a failure. Centro Democrático and other anti-Petro forces argue that ceasefires gave these groups time to reorganize, expand territory, and strengthen illegal economies. Their message is simple: you don't negotiate with criminals, you dismantle them. Petro's coalition rejects that framing. They argue that Colombia's violence didn't begin in 2022 and it won't disappear overnight. According to them, total peace is an attempt to finish a 50-year conflict without repeating the militarized strategies of the past, which reduced violence temporarily but never dismantled its roots. They say negotiations are slow, but war is slower. Now add corruption on top of that, and it gets worse. There's no good elections without some genuine scandal. Here's a few of them. UNGRD scandal, one of the most controversial and damaging for leading politicians. A government agency responsible for disaster risk management was accused of purchasing overpriced and defective water trucks and allegedly redirecting public funds through political networks. What was supposed to deliver water to vulnerable communities became a symbol of supposed clientelism and misuse of public money. The scandal widened. Former high-level officials close to the government faced investigations. Opposition leaders argued that the administration promised a moral transformation but ended up reproducing the same political practices it once condemned. The Petrogate recordings. In 2024, audio recordings surfaced allegedly showing people close to the government discussing the use of campaign funds improperly. The government denied wrongdoing, but the scandal fueled opposition calls for impeachment, which went nowhere but damaged Petro politically. Nicolas Petro, the president's own son, was arrested and convicted in 2024 on charges related to drug trafficking money entering his father's 2022 campaign. This was devastating optics and a genuine scandal. The president publicly distanced himself from his son, but the damage was done. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Corruption in Colombia didn't begin with Petro. Former President Alvaro Uribe, a central figure of the conservative opposition, spent years fighting accusations that he manipulated witnesses in a case related to supposed links to paramilitary groups. The case polarized the country and reinforced a deeper perception. Colombia's political class, across ideologies, has struggled with credibility. So when Colombians head to the polls, their choice is often limited to who they perceive as the least corrupted option. They're choosing between competing promises of reform in a system where trust has been repeatedly broken. Legislative polls are rarer than presidential ones, but two national snapshots from mid-January tell a consistent story. First, in Guarumo and Eco Analítica's Percepción País Senate vote intention poll, Petro's Pacto Histórico leads at about 27%, with Uribe's Centro Democrático around 20%. After that, the field collapses into single digits. Liberals and conservatives are roughly around 5% each, and everything else is fragmented. So you're looking at the Congress shaped by two polls at the top and long tail of smaller players. The second snapshot comes from RCN's La Gran Encuesta by GAD3. It shows the same shape. Pacto still first at about 23%, Centro Democrático second at about 15%, and then long tail again. But here's the real takeaway. Uncertainty is massive. Between don't know, abstention, and blank vote, a huge chunk of the electorate is still movable, meaning the seat map can shift late, even if the top two stay the same. So what could happen after March 8th? Think in four scenarios, not who wins, but who can actually build a majority. Scenario 1. Left plurality, fragile governing deal. The status quo mostly holds. Petro's side can still steer, but reforms get watered down and every vote becomes a negotiation. Scenario 2. An anti-Petro majority forms. Centro Democrático doesn't need to beat Pacto alone. It just needs enough partners to create a blocking majority, which can freeze legislation, control committees, and turn Congress into a wall. In that world, the left may still be number one, but it loses real governing capacity. Scenario 3. Kingmakers run the show. Fragmentation gets so extreme that mid-size and small parties become the true power center. Policy becomes less about ideology and more about traits. Support on one bill in exchange for budgets, posts, and regional priorities. The headline isn't left versus right, it's coalition market politics. Scenario 4. The uncertainty vote flips the map. If the big fog, don't know, abstention, blank vote, breaks late in one direction, the outcome can swing hard. That's how we get surprises. A stronger right-center wave or a weaker turnout for the government side, even without a dramatic shift in party loyalty. So the trend isn't simply Petro wins or Petro loses. The trend is two poles dominate and the rest of Congress becomes a bargaining market. March 8 is likely to decide not the clean mandate, but the balance of leverage and who gets to write the deal. Mark Bowden in Killing Pablo quotes a dark Colombian joke. God made our land so beautiful it was unfair to the rest of the world. So to even the score, God populated it with a race of evil men. And it's hard not to think about it when you look at the decades of violence and a web of alliances so complicated that I wouldn't be surprised if even the fighters didn't know who they were fighting with anymore. In a country with the Andes, the Amazon, the River of Five Colors, and breathtaking coastlines on both the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean. And maybe that's Colombia's tragedy and its strength. A country beautiful enough to inspire myths and complicated enough to break them. On March 8th, Colombians won't just be choosing parties. They'll be choosing what kind of rules the next chapter is written under. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you like this video, subscribe for more. Next, Hungary's elections. The stakes are huge and Europe is watching closely.